I'm pleased to be here, part of this conversation, and what I'd like to do is, obviously, everybody here has been following the recent demonstrations in Turkey, talk to you about what they mean in terms of Turkish politics, but especially Turkish foreign policy. Can you hear me? Great, okay, excellent. So you follow the demonstrations. These are new in the sense that I think this is the first time in recent memory you're seeing massive and grassroots demonstrations in Turkey. In this regard, I think they're similar to the demonstrations we had in Israel last year. They were attended mostly by middle class, they're grassroots, they seem to come from nowhere, and yet they captured public attention for about a month. But let's start to see first what the demonstrations are not about, and I'll tell you what they're about next, and then I'll tell you how they will shape Turkey's foreign policy. What the demonstrations are not about. This is not a spring. This is not the Arab Spring, because Turkey never had winter. This is a country that's a democracy, that remains a democracy, that has a viable democratic opposition on the street. It is also not a sign of support for the governing Justice and Development Party, AKP, slipping. The AKP is the most popular party in Turkey. It's supported by about half of the Turks as of the last elections, and most polls show that support for AKP remains the same. What they are about, though, the demonstrations, is they're about the other half of Turkey, which does not vote for the governing party, taking their opposition from the parliament to the streets. So they decided to confront the government through public protests and demonstrations. That's new. And I think it's that half of the country which represents the secular, leftist, middle-class, liberal voices, and these are not necessarily overlapping constituencies. All these different groups have decided to take issue with the AKP, and now they're on the street. And I think what's unique about them, as I said earlier, they're grassroots. They really came out of an environment movement, pro-environmental movement, to save a downtown park. It would have been unthinkable 10 years ago that a large pro-environment movement in Turkey would turn into a movement that would bring 1 million people to the streets. In this regard, I think the governing party, AKP, is the victim of its own success. It has made Turkey a majority middle-class society. Turkey has really done well economically in the last decade. If you've been there in the 1990s and if you went there recently, big change. As of 2010, 55% of the Turks were classified as middle class. For the first time, this is a majority middle-class society. By the end of this decade, it will be 80% middle class. And because it has become middle class, I think people are making some very middle-class demands now. Respect for individual rights, the urban space, the environment, freedom of expression, freedom of association. So the governing party is checked by the economic wealth that it has created. This is, I think, why, even though the demonstrations might fizzle out this time, they will come back. Because the demonstrations have seen that they have strength in numbers. More than 1 million people participated in rallies in over 78 cities. They have the organizing force of social media. The demonstrations were primarily sustained on Twitter and Facebook. NYU, New York University did a research which showed that during the Tahrir demonstrations, not that I'm making a comparison between Turkey and Egypt, but just to show you the dynamics, during Tahrir demonstrations, 30% of the tweets about the demonstrations came from Cairo and were in Arabic. During the Taksim protest, 80% of the tweets came from Istanbul and they were in Turkish. This has to do with literacy rates, internet penetration rates, smartphone ownership, and all of these are middle class related developments. So I think that's why we'll see similar protests taking the opposition to the government from the parliament to the streets, whether it's another issue over the environment or an issue of foreign policy, which is why I think the demonstrations are going to shape the government's foreign policy. Now that, despite the fact that it has run Turkey for about 11 years, the governing AKP has realized that it has a strong opposition on the streets, and this opposition can sustain itself if it decides to take issue with the government. So this will challenge the government's Syria policy primarily. Turkey's policy on Syria so far has been very frontal. Turkey has confronted the Assad regime from 2011 onwards. It worked to undermine it. It has actually, I would say, since Turkey became a modern republic in 1923, this was the first time Turkey pursued a policy of regime change in a neighboring country. And it hasn't worked. It has not worked because Turkey has realized that it supports the rebels, but Iran arms and supports the regime. Turkey and Iran are locked in a proxy war, and Turkey has suffered from its very forward Syria policy. The recent attacks on a Turkish town in Reyhanlı on the border with Syria killed 51 people. This is the worst terror attack against Turkey in its modern history. Now, a lot of people in Turkey they want Assad to go, but they don't support the government's policy, which they think has exposed Turkey too much because Turkey is the leading country. This is why I think this new opposition on the street is going to force Turkey to water down its Syria policy. The joke in Washington is that the United States is leading from behind on Syria. I think now Ankara and Washington are going to compete to lead from behind in Syria. Turkey will pull further back. So, if the US is going to arm the rebels, for example, Turkey is going to ask that effort is shifted primarily to Jordan and not down from its territory. So I think that will temper Turkey's policy further. I can see how if the government is very forward on Syria without building consensus, the next wave of demonstrations could have Syria as a component, not necessarily as a driving force. Other issues. Does that shape Turkey's relations with Israel? I think Turkish-Israeli normalization will move forward, though with turtle steps, primarily because the two countries have strategic agreement on Syria. I think there are three threats from Syria that are common for Turks and Israelis. The first is a Somalia-style failed state next door as a result of regime collapse. That's bad for Israelis and bad for Turks. Second is Al-Qaeda penetration, bad for Turks and bad for Israelis. Third is chemical weapons proliferation that will unite Turkey and Israel to work together. I think Turkey and Israel will also move for normalization, though behind the scenes, because now Turkey realized that Iran is Ankara's chief competitor in the Fertile Crescent, where Turkey and Iran are locked in a proxy war in Syria. Turkey supports the rebels, Iran supports the regime. They're actually fighting a proxy war. In Iraq, there's a political proxy war. The Iranian government supports the Shiite majority government in Baghdad. Turkey supports the Sunnis in the north. This explains the rapprochement between Turkey and the Iraqi Kurds. So for Turkey, the competitor in the region is Iran. And though it's not a military confrontation, it sees itself in a political contest with the Iranians for power in the region. Final point, Turkish-US ties. How does Turkey's new political landscape shape Turkey-US relations? I think not much. Turkey and US have a strong relationship. Part of it is the fact that Turkey is America's only ally. It's also a NATO ally, remember, but it's also only ally of the United States that borders Iran, Iraq, and Syria. Whatever the US policies on those three countries, you need Turkey to get it done. So it's a tactical, pragmatic, and strategic ally at the same time. And I think just as the US wants to preserve its good relationship with Turkey, Turkey also wants to maintain the relationship and has a lot to lose from changing its good relationship with the US, primarily because, as I said earlier, Turkey's Syria policy cannot be done without US assistance. Turkey has come to a point where its policy of regime change against the Assad regime has hit its natural limits. And at this point, for Turkey to become successful to take this policy to the next level, which would be ousting the Assad regime, it needs US support. And even if that's not the goal, if the goal is, let's be less minimalistic, if the goal is to contain the Syrian war in Syria, Turkey needs the US for that end as well. Remember the recent deployment of Patriot missiles in Turkey, which came as Turkey's request. US and other countries send Turkey hardware. What that means about Turkey's role in the region, final point is, I think interestingly, you've seen Turkey become a Middle East power in the last decade. And then the Syrian war has exposed that perhaps not so fast. Turkey has a lot of economic power. It is the Middle East's largest economy. Its economy is $1.3 trillion. It's twice almost the size of Iranian and Saudi economies. And those are energy-inflated economies. It's got a lot of soft power. Its soap operas are watched in all Arab capitals. Its airline is the best in the region. Its businesses are very successful. But it does not have the hard power to match this hard power. And I think the Syrian war has shown the limits of Turkish hard power. In this regard, I think Turkey in the Middle East is like Japan in East Asia. Japan is the dominant power of East Asia economically. It has a lot of soft power. But it needs the US to protect itself against China and North Korea. This is exactly today's Turkey. Turkey is economically powerful, it has a lot of soft power, but it needs the US to contain the crisis in Syria, to bring its Syria policy to fruition, and also in the long term to balance itself against Iran. So I think that will drive further Turkey's pivot to the US. Thank you.